In the previous episode, we saw someone grab the protagonist's hand from the dark and pull her into a corner. Now, we see that the person is none other than her own brother. "Who are you?" "Edith, have you already forgotten my voice?" he asks. The protagonist had forgotten that her family could also attend the charity auction. Shane Reigelhoff is Edith's real brother, whom the protagonist had forgotten about. The protagonist's brother was visibly distressed. "What on earth happened to you? Are the Rudwicks keeping you under watch?" he asked. He recalled the letter where the protagonist had mentioned stopping their pursuit of the Rudwicks, which he had initially dismissed as a joke. But then, the protagonist had sent documents about weapons, which turned out to be falsified. "They were testing you by giving you false documents, weren't they? Did you send that letter because they were watching?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. We know Reigelhoffs had no real concern for the protagonist's well-being, they were simply using her for their profit. The protagonist shows a sense of disgust.
"You seem to be misunderstanding something. My advice in the letter was sincere, and exactly when, where, and from whom did you get that document about the weapons? That false document was not from me,"
she clarified. Meanwhile, Killian is waiting outside for the protagonist to return, his eyes scanning the area for her. A few hours earlier, before approaching anyone at the charity auction, Killian had been hiding in the bushes and overheard a conversation between the protagonist and some women who were gossiping about Rice. He listened to how Edith defended Rice against the ladies who were speaking ill of her, and the protagonist has also heard what all the women think about Edith. Apparently, even Killian, her own husband, ignores her, and no one acknowledges her in Rudwick Manor. After a while, Killian becomes bored of waiting. So he decides to check himself where the protagonist is. He checks the bathroom and sees the protagonist talking to her brother, Shane Reigelhoff. He hides behind the wall and tries to listen to their conversation but can't hear anything because of the distance, and after a while, the protagonist ends the conversation and takes a deep breath of relief. As she moved, she spotted Killian standing behind the wall with a surprised look on his face. Killian calmly asked her what took so long, hoping she would be honest with him, but she lied and brushed off the question. On the way back to the venue, "Did you come to look for me?" she asked. "Why? Does that give you butterflies?" "Of course. Having someone care about your absence would make anyone's heart pound. Why is she looking at me like that?" As Killian and Edith were having a conversation, an announcement was made, notifying everyone that this year's charity auction was a success and that every donated item had been sold for a high price. Suddenly, Edith realized that if everything had been sold, it meant someone had bought her handkerchief too. "I was worried my handkerchief would be the last item left over," she said. We see a flashback where Killian's mother, Mrs. Duchess, telling Killian about the handkerchief Edith had made herself inspired by his eyes. And protagonist was thinking about him while making it. In the present, Killian is holding that handkerchief in his pocket. He murmured to himself, "I bet she was just trying to win over my mother, and it would be a disgrace to our family name if one of our donations went unbought." He satisfies his ego by clarifying his actions to himself. The following day, a maid appeared at Rudwick Manor causing a commotion outside as she repeatedly shouting the protagonist's name. Accompanying her was Shane Reigelhoff, protagonist's brother, who had caused this scene to trouble the Rudwicks and increase her sister's misery. Shane leveraged the recent events to manipulate the situation. He addressed the onlookers, expressing sorrow over the loss of his sister, claiming that the maid, Sophia, was distraught by hearing Edith had been mistreated at the Rudwick Manor. His narrative painted a picture of concern, suggesting that the protagonist was not allowed to join social events with her friends. In truth, the protagonist chooses to decline invitations to improve her image, as Edith is portrayed as an evil character in the story. With ulterior motives, Shane aimed to make the protagonist's life difficult. His words dripped with disdain as he reminded her of her place within the Rudwick household, suggesting that just because she resided there didn't mean he couldn't cause her trouble. As the uproar continued, Killian stepped forward with a counter-suggestion. If the Reigelhoffs were truly worried about their sister, they should leave Sophia with the Rudwicks. He reasoned that having Sophia, Edith's childhood maid, around would alleviate their concerns. The protagonist, in a moment of fear, called out for Killian, denying the need for a maid from her father's household. In the midst of this confrontation, she felt a wave of dizziness as a warning from within flashed before her. As she stumbled, her old maid caught her, whispering maliciously into her ear with a self-satisfied smirk before leading her away. In disbelief, the protagonist questioned whether the events were unfolding as they had in the original story or if the plot was veering into uncharted territory. With Sophia now inside Rudwick Manor, she knew that the impending narrative would center around Sophia's scheming, leaking critical information, acting as a spy, and even attempting assassination through poison. The scene shifted as Sophia viciously seized the protagonist, bullying her as she used to do at home. The protagonist felt like she was being reminded of her supposed place, who her real master is, with Sophia insisting that she needed to show the protagonist her true standing. Sophia glared at the protagonist and began beating her ruthlessly. "You don't seem to understand your situation, miss. All you need to do is play the pretty doll who does as your master tells you to. The moment you outlive your worth, we will just kill you and blame the Rudwicks for your death." The scene shifts to the following morning, where the protagonist struggles through her work, her body aching from Sophia's beating the day before. Since Sophia's arrival at Rudwick Manor, the protagonist's freedom has slowly been stripped away. Sophia abuses her, spies on her, and even withholds food. Later, while working, the protagonist reflects on her life, noting how, in both this life and her past, she never imagined she would find the courage to stand against such cruelty. But she refuses to give up, especially when she thinks of Edith, who has endured similar abuse since childhood without any escape. After some time, we see the protagonist sitting alone in her room, hungry and ignored. No one notices her absence at dinner, as she's long been accustomed to eating alone since her house arrest. Anna used to bring her meals, but with Sophia now in control, the protagonist is deprived of food. Her stomach growls, and she murmurs, "I'm so hungry, I think I'm starting to imagine things." Her thoughts drift to Killian, wondering about his recent actions and if he truly cares for her. After a few moments, the protagonist is desperate to escape before Sophia returns with another cruel temptation. The protagonist goes for a walk in search of food. Meanwhile, Sophia is also thinking about the changes in the protagonist's behavior. Baffled by the protagonist's sudden defiance. "I trained her for years, how could she change so quickly? She used to cower from a single slap, but now she dares to glare back after being hit." Watching her defiance break is becoming an intriguing challenge. As Sophia walks through the hall, she overhears someone mentioning the protagonist's name and sees her talking to Rice. A flashback reveals that the protagonist's brother had instructed Sophia to watch over Rice and learn more about her. Anger rises in Sophia, who has harbored feelings for Shane Reigelhoff herself, though she never dared to dream of becoming his wife. But seeing a bastard lowborn of a lowly maid seduces him with her fake innocence. After some time, the protagonist returned to her room, still feeling the gnawing hunger in her stomach. Just then, Sophia entered, presenting a slice of peach pie alongside a steaming cup of black tea. The protagonist was taken aback. She wouldn't have expected such hospitality from Sophia. Without giving it a second thought, she dove into the pie because of hunger. However, as she took her first bite, an unexpected sensation overwhelmed her. Suddenly, she was coughing, blood staining her lips as she fell to her knees, a chilling memory surfacing. Edith had poisoned herself in the story, but the protagonist herself hadn't done anything like that. The protagonist looks up, she catches a glimpse of Sophia's face, twisted into an unsettling evil smile. It sent a shiver down to the protagonist's spine as she heard Sophia's voice. The protagonist thought to herself, "It's just like in the novel." In the book, Edith poisons the pie to give herself a stomachache and tries to blame it on Rice. Now, Sophia is the one who poisoned me and is trying to blame it on Rice. The protagonist woke up and tried to stop Sophia from creating a scene, apologizing to Rice for Sophia's behavior. But Cliff didn't believe her words and ordered a search of the protagonist's room. Sophia tried to intervene, but the protagonist just watched as they found a suspicious-looking bottle. The protagonist denied that the bottle doesn't belong to her. Cliff accuses her. "So, are you saying someone snuck into your room and hid this in your cabinet?" He accused the protagonist of faking everything and poisoning herself to defame Rice. Rice tried to stop Cliff, reminding him that the protagonist was already sick. Cliff warns the protagonist that he will return after investigating the bottle of poison. We could see the fear on Sophia's face. The protagonist mocked Sophia. "You are all talk and no brain. You are not as clever as you pretend to be. Cliff found the bottle so easily. Is this you? Oversight or you are a fool." Sophia left the room, threatening the protagonist that if she said another word, she would kill her and blame Rudwick. In the next scene, we see Killian standing near the wall, listening to the conversation between Cliff and the doctor. The doctor explained that the poison was not strong but could cause pain and potentially some bleeding. After getting all the details about the poison, then Killian gets his chance to ask about the protagonist's situation and ask something to ease her suffering. The doctor replied, I have already prescribed her some painkillers, but you shouldn't expect them to have much effect on your wife. Killian, puzzled, asked why, since the poison wasn't strong. The doctor explained that the protagonist hadn't eaten in several days, so even weak poison would have a strong effect on her. Killian was stunned for a moment. A girl like her, who enjoyed food and couldn't resist it, had starved herself. He wondered if the protagonist could really have poisoned herself, knowing her body was in such a state. He thought, she did something so foolish just to get attention. What a pathetic and obstinate woman she is. He questioned whether the protagonist could really go that low for attention. Before she married him, she was always the center of attention in the social world, good or bad. But after marrying him, she became a second thought. Perhaps she was doing this to get attention, not to accuse Rice. What a scary woman she is. Killian created his own thoughts about the protagonist based on his knowledge of Edith. There's nothing I can do except watch her suffer, he thought. Edith was unaware that Killian was watching her the whole time. She thought she heard Killian's voice. Killian whispered, and somehow the protagonist heard him, Why would you poison yourself? The protagonist replied, You believe I did it too? Killian, in a worried tone, asked, Are you awake? The protagonist requests him to leave the room immediately. The protagonist had promised herself not to get her hopes up, yet it stung to realize that, ultimately, it was Rice who had come to her rescue. In a moment of reflection, she expressed her gratitude, acknowledging Rice as an angel and a true heroine, admitting to her doubts. Wanting to show appreciation for Rice's support, the protagonist sought Mrs. Duchess's advice on what Rice might like. Mrs. Duchess mentioned that Rice had a fondness for needlework and books, suggesting that while selecting a book might be challenging, a thoughtful gift related to her needlework could be a good idea. Consequently, the protagonist decided to present Rice with some fine silk threads as a token of her thanks. A week later, the protagonist was dancing with excitement in her room, eager to begin her work again and escape Sophia's watchful eyes. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside, and Killian rushed in, urgently inquiring about Rice's condition and accusing the protagonist of poisoning her with the threads she had gifted. The protagonist was taken aback. It seemed impossible. She had purchased the threads from a sewing supply shop, and no one had access to them after they were packaged. As she reflected on the original plotline where Sophia attempted to poison Rice by applying poison to the needle she gifted, doubt crept in. Had her well-meaning change inadvertently allowed for the original narrative to intertwine, leading to the substitution of her innocent gift with something tainted? Killian's firm grip pulled her back to the present as he demanded to know what she had done. Frustrated, the protagonist tried to explain that everyone was already casting suspicious eyes in her direction due to the incident with the pie. Why would I engage in such reckless behavior that would only attract more attention to me? Killian emphasized, You must think I don't want to believe you, but do you realize how many times this has happened now? Why can't you help me trust you, Edith? The protagonist moved closer to Killian, hoping to win him over. I don't want you to suspect me either, so hire a maid to surveillance me at all times. Sophia objected and growled in anger, but the protagonist smartly handled her. Sophia, there's nothing to worry about. I am innocent. Even if we call it surveillance, it's just another maid. The protagonist cleverly leveraged the situation in her favor, knowing that with surveillance, Sophia couldn't play her scheming tricks and harm her. The protagonist insisted that without volunteering for this, she wouldn't be able to prove her innocence. Killian agreed to her request and ordered a maid to call Anna for surveillance. The protagonist thought to herself, I am glad Killian reacted swiftly. If he had left the room even for a second, Sophia would have gotten her hands on me right away. Killian had resolved the matter, but the protagonist still had to explain how Rice ended up poisoned. She suggested interrogating the merchant who sold her the threads. Killian informed her that they had already taken him into custody. He had a thriving business, so why would he risk his livelihood on this? The protagonist agreed and asked if anyone else had access to those threads after she gifted them. Killian replied, Not many people can freely enter Rice's room, Rice's maids, Cliff, my mother, and myself. The protagonist speculated, I know I might sound like I'm making excuses, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is using me as a scapegoat to harass Rice. Someone who would benefit if Rice were seriously hurt or died, or if I were punished for her loss. For example, the Sinclairs might fall into that category. I heard rumors about her half-siblings trying to harm her several times. Let's be honest. This manor has many staff. Can you be sure that none of the Sinclair's spies have managed to infiltrate this house? Killian responded, You make it sound as if we also have a spy from the Reigelhofs in our midst. The protagonist continued, I am sure the Rudwicks have done the same. You know I would figure out as much. At first, I thought the Rudwicks were trying to frame me to humiliate the Reigelhofs. Killian swore, We would never stoop so low. I swear on my honor. We would never do such a thing. The protagonist laughed, Ha ha ha, that certainly didn't take much to set you off. But even when I swore, no one believed me. Well, it's not as if I blame you. Don't think that anymore. Killian admitted, Once I thought more about it, I didn't think you would put that much effort into me. You are surprisingly self-aware. Your hypothesis makes a lot of sense, but I am not sure if my father or my brother will agree. The protagonist thought to herself, At least he's pretending to trust me. He didn't seem to believe me about the pie. I understand. As long as we are being honest, I don't particularly want to prove my innocence to them. Rice is the only one I want to trust me. To be honest, it's not just Rice, but I don't need to tell him the whole truth. Rice is still doing her best to stay on the Rudwicks' good side. But she defended me, even if it meant she would have to go against the Rudwicks. If she thinks my presence were an attempt on her life, she will be disappointed in me. Killian raised an eyebrow and asked, Don't you resent Rice? The protagonist replied, What? Why would I? Killian explained, Well, since everyone praises her and not you. The protagonist asserted, Killian, let's get this straight, I'm Edith Rudwick. Do you think I would envy another woman over the opinions of others? The protagonist thought to herself, I never thought I would see the day when I could say that. As the protagonist was busy admiring herself, Killian grabbed her by the neck, tilted her towards him, and put his gentle lips on her. The protagonist was surprised by the sudden change of air but got lost in the moment. After a moment, they both looked into each other's eyes, and the protagonist whispered his name. Killian blushed and apologized for his sudden move. A few days later, the protagonist had barely shaken off the news from Anna, another house arrest. The poison in question was too ordinary, its source untraceable. The Duke had decided there wasn't enough evidence to push for more severe punishment, merely confinement within the manor walls. Across the manor, we see Cliff sitting beside Rice's bed. His anger radiates in his eyes, holding her frail hand and cursing the protagonist's name. In the next scene, within the royal palace walls, a tense conversation unfolded between Princess Katrin, the Emperor's younger sister, and Cliff discussing the current situation of Rice. Indignation, Princess Katrin slammed her hand on the table, outraged that Duke Rudwick had only placed Edith under house arrest. And the shocking thing for both is Killian also supports the protagonist in this current situation. Previous day back at Rudwick Manor, Killian snapped, You're letting your emotions blind you, Cliff. If Edith poisoned Rice, how did she manage it under the Rudwick's unblinking eyes? Cliff bristled, Then someone must have poisoned something she'd surely touch. Killian leaned closer, his eyes fierce. Are our spies suddenly so useless? Think it through, Cliff. This moment of doubt among the men ended when Duke Rudwick himself intervened, issuing a temporary gag order. The situation would remain confidential until they uncovered more concrete evidence. Currently, we observe Cliff and Princess Katrin conspiring against the protagonist. The scene shifts and we see the protagonist entering the palace grounds, accompanied by Duke Rudwick. She couldn't ignore the fact, she was never meant to be here, it was never part of the original story's plotline. And yet, here she was, summoned by none other than Princess Katrin herself. Hours earlier, the protagonist had visited the Mrs. Duchess after her full recovery, when she received the news. The princess wants to see her, the Duchess said. This is a great opportunity for the protagonist to become friends with Princess Katrin. Now, standing in the Grand Palace Hall, Edith's mind swirled with questions. Princess Katrin had a reputation for wild independence, shirking formalities, ignoring dresses, even sporting a short, rebellious bob. She was notorious for defying every rule in the book. The protagonist had once admired her rebellious spirit when reading the story. But now, face to face with Katrin's cold stare, that admiration felt dangerously misplaced. I suspected she called me with hostile intentions, but this I worse than I imagined. Bowed, greeting the princess, who responded only with a dismissive glance. The protagonist can't say anything besides standing silently until Princess Katrin accepts her greeting. Princess Katrin glances at the protagonist and addresses the protagonist as another Reigelhof. The protagonist lowers her chin and replies, "My name is Edith Rudwick, Your Highness," in a sad tone. And then Princess Katrin mocks the protagonist, "I didn't prepare any tea. I hope you understand. After all, you are infamous for using poison on people." Princess Katrin accuses the protagonist indirectly of poisoning rice. The protagonist realizes everything is set by Cliff. The protagonist seemed indifferent toward Princess Katrin, meeting her rudeness with a gaze that revealed no desire for acceptance. She acknowledged the truth in Katrin's words, admitting that while she had never resorted to poison, her previous actions could indeed be seen as unwise, likely leading to misunderstandings fueled by rumors. The princess pointed out that the marriage had come about solely because of Reigelhof's insistence, shifting the burden squarely onto Killian's shoulders. The protagonist, "My maiden family made that decision. Although I have already left them behind, I cannot feign innocence." Princess Katrin accuses the protagonist, "Even though you speak to me about loyalty, you are just like any of the aristocrats who lust after my brother and my throne. How do I know you aren't filling my ears with empty words? And I bet you think I look ridiculous like this." The protagonist puts a smile on her face and replies, "Not at all, I respect you, Your Highness." We see the protagonist recalling some glimpse of the original story after Grand Duke Langston's rebellion fails near the end of the book. Rice and Katrin spend some time together on La Belle Marie venue. Katrin wears a wig to hide her true identity. They visit dress shops and Katrin ends up wearing a dress for the first time since her debutante days. Then she changes her attitude and starts hosting tea parties at the palace with Rice's help. She eventually matures into her responsibilities as a princess and leads the social scene. But the protagonist always preferred the independent princess who sought freedom above all else and did what she believed was right, no matter what others might say. Returning to the present, Edith met Katrin's wary gaze with a steady look. "Please, Your Highness, let your own wisdom judge me, not the rumors." After hearing the protagonist's words, Princess Katrin blinked, momentarily caught off guard and moved by what she heard. The scene shifts to the protagonist returning to Rudwick Manor, where she appears worried about not choosing her words wisely in front of Princess Katrin. Suddenly, the protagonist felt a firm hand grip her from behind, yanking her into the shadows. She gasped as her back hit the cold stone wall, only to find herself face to face with Sophia. Without a word, Sophia's hand shot to her throat, fingers tightening as her eyes glinted with a deadly resolve. "This is your last chance," Sophia hissed, her voice low and venomous. "If you betray the master again, I'll end you myself." The threat hung in the air like a dagger, sharp and unforgiving. The protagonist struggled to breathe, eyes wide with fear and understanding. There would be no mercy if she failed. Sophia's gaze was icy as she studied the protagonist, her lips curling with a mixture of scorn and amusement. "Why are you in such a hurry to be sent to your grave?" she murmured, voice almost soft but laced with venom. "Did your time with that family cloud your mind? Obsessing over that bastard child? I thought you'd regain your senses after poisoning his thread. But instead, you used it to try and run from me." Her grip tightened mercilessly, leaving the protagonist struggling for breath, vision blurring. Sophia's tone dropped to a chilling whisper. "If you want death so badly, I'll gladly grant it. My master has already given me his blessing." Just as darkness began to edge in, Sophia released her grip, letting the protagonist crumple to the ground, gasping for air. Her voice was cold and final. "Consider this your last chance," she warned. "Steal the dukedom's tax records, or next time, I won't let go." The protagonist gasped for air, struggling to speak. "What if they find out you're behind my death?" Sophia's lips curled into a smug smile. "Let me worry about that. If it comes to it, the Rudwicks will take the fall." The protagonist forced herself to look up, her voice hoarse but defiant. "And what if I tell everyone what you've done?" Sophia chuckled, her tone laced with mock pity. "You would have told them long ago if you could. You think I don't know why you're silent? The Reigelhofs don't care about you, and when that becomes clear, Killian Rudwick will gladly watch you be thrown out." The protagonist's mind raced, bitter thoughts rising. "You know nothing, Sophia. If it weren't for the constraints placed on me, But even if I could break free, would I dare risk losing him to Rice? Sophia settled down beside her, speaking in a voice almost pleasant. And once you're no longer useful, my master will make sure you're put to use in ways you can't imagine. I'm sure you understand the kind of life that awaits. She gripped the protagonist's chin, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. But steal the documents, and maybe I'll speak favorably of you to young Master Shane. Even you should understand the value of that. The protagonist met Sophia's gaze with a deadened stare, her voice a whisper that barely masked her loathing. Then here's my prediction for the future. No matter what you try, the Reigelhoff family will fall. And even my brother, whom you so admire, will face ruin. A shadow crossed Sophia's face, her jaw tensing, teeth grinding as rage simmered beneath the surface. Without another word, she struck, fists flying as her anger spilled over, relentless and brutal.
Hey, if you enjoyed this content and made it to the end of the video, click that subscribe button and be part of our adventure. Thank you so much.